What happens when quiet power meets loud prejudice at 30,000 feet? A wealthy family boards a first-class cabin, confident, entitled, and already judging. But the man they tried to ignore. He's about to change everything with just one name. This isn't just a flight, it's a wake-up call. Stay with us as secrets unravel and respect is earned without a single raised voice. Backhand index pointing down. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful true-to-life stories, the hum of rolling luggage, the distant chatter of flight announcements, and the rhythmic footsteps of early morning travelers filled Stonebridge International Airport with a pulse of controlled chaos. The air smelled faintly of espresso and jet fuel. Men in suits typed furiously on their phones, parents corralled sleepy children, and tourists clung to boarding passes as if they were passports to another life. Among the crowd stood Elliot Morgan, a poised African-American man in his late 30s, dressed in a slate-gray custom suit that spoke of taste and discipline rather than extravagance. There was a quiet power to his presence, the kind that made people instinctively make way without knowing why. In one hand, he carried a sleek obsidian briefcase, in the other, a tablet that glowed faintly with graphs and bullet points. His eyes were focused, calm, and unyielding. Elliot wasn't headed on a vacation or a casual business trip, he was flying to Manhattan for the most pivotal meeting of his career. As the founder and CEO of Morgan Cyber Systems, a fast-rising cybersecurity company, Elliot was on the cusp of securing a $40 million Series C investment. Years of uphill battles, 16-hour workdays, and conference rooms filled with dismissive glances had brought him to this point. The pitch he would deliver in New York wasn't just a presentation. It was a declaration of his worth, one that no one could afford to ignore. While checking over his final slides, Elliot's focus was briefly interrupted by a commotion nearby. Just a few feet away stood a family of four dressed in pristine, coordinated designer outfits. The father, Douglas Whitmore, had a commanding look, silver hair slicked back, jaw square and clenched, his navy blazer hugging a gym-toned frame. His wife, Genevieve, was wrapped in an ivory wool coat that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle. Their two teenage children were deeply engaged with their phones, tapping and scrolling with robotic precision. At first, Elliot barely noticed them. But something about the family's body language stirred his attention. Douglas's eyes scanned the terminal with the kind of detached contempt reserved for people who never had to share space. When his gaze landed on Elliot, there was a subtle yet unmistakable shift, his lips tightened, his jaw twitched, and a faint, dismissive shake of the head followed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't overt. But it was there. Elliot had seen it before, at boardrooms, fundraisers, elevators. The unspoken disapproval. The silent appraisal of someone who didn't fit the presumed mold. But he gave no visible reaction. Instead, he tapped a line on his tablet and adjusted his sleeve. The boarding announcement echoed over the intercom. Flight 237 to New York, now boarding first-class passengers. Elliot inhaled slowly, tucked his tablet under one arm, and walked with quiet precision toward Gate 8, unaware, or perhaps all too aware, that this flight would be remembered for much more than its destination. Elliot Morgan stepped into the aircraft cabin with the composed confidence of a man who had mastered the art of silence. Flight 237's first-class section was modest but well-appointed, wide leather seats, polished trim, soft lighting that mimicked the golden hour. Seat 2A, a window seat, was his. He slid his briefcase into the overhead bin, careful not to disturb the neatly folded overcoat within, and settled in with his tablet resting across his lap. As he powered on the device, the screen sprang to life with colorful infographics, encryption models, and fiscal projections. He had rehearsed this pitch a dozen times, but Elliot believed in perfection by repetition. He began reviewing again, fine-tuning his delivery, until the shifting noise of luxury shoes on carpeted aisle drew his attention. The Whitmore family had boarded. Douglas led the group down the aisle like a man walking into a room he believed he owned. Genevieve trailed just behind, one manicured hand resting gently on the handle of her handbag. The children followed, still glued to their phones, oblivious to the human world around them. When Douglas spotted Elliot in seat 2A, he halted for half a second. His face darkened, almost imperceptibly, but not to Elliot. He leaned into Genevieve, whispering through clenched teeth, "You've got to be kidding me. We're seated next to him." Genevieve, more composed than her husband, cast a sideways glance at Elliot. Her tone, though hushed, carried a firm edge. "It's a few hours, Douglas. Don't make a scene." Elliot heard every word. He didn't need to. He'd heard variations of it all his life. He kept his eyes on his screen, his hands steady. No blink. No response. Moments later, Douglas flagged down a passing flight attendant. A young woman with a practiced smile and neat brunette bun turned to him. "Good evening, sir. Can I help you?" "Yes," Douglas replied, his voice clipped and formal. "We were hoping to be seated elsewhere. Preferably away from this section." The woman blinked, momentarily thrown. "I'm sorry, sir, but first class is fully booked. Every passenger has an assigned seat." He exhaled with audible irritation. "We paid a premium for these seats. Surely there's some flexibility." "I understand," she said, her tone still warm but firm. "If anything becomes available, I'll let you know." She gave a polite nod and moved on, leaving Douglas visibly irritated. Genevieve murmured something soothing to him, but his posture remained rigid, his jaw locked. Elliot continued reading his slides, his demeanor unchanged. He had built Morgan Cyber Systems from the ground up, often pitching in rooms filled with men like Douglas Whitmore, well-dressed, well-connected skeptics who looked at him and saw potential only after they saw credentials. He'd grown adept at enduring their silences, their loaded glances, their polite dismissals. But Elliot had learned something early in his career: silence, when wielded correctly, could speak louder than indignation. The plane began its taxi down the runway. Soft classical music played faintly through the cabin speakers. Seat belts clicked into place. Douglas gave Elliot one more sidelong glance before shifting in his seat, huffing as though personally inconvenienced by Elliot's presence. At 30,000 feet, tension still hung faintly in the air. But Elliot was calm, collected, scrolling through his presentation like nothing else existed. He didn't need validation. He needed only one thing: to land in New York, walk into that boardroom, and secure a future for the company he'd poured his life into. Across the aisle, Genevieve offered Elliot a brief, unreadable glance, neither apology nor curiosity. Just observation. Her lips pressed together, not quite a frown. Douglas remained stiff beside her, legs crossed too sharply, as if bracing against the idea of proximity. Elliot didn't flinch. He knew what they saw when they looked at him: a man they hadn't expected in this seat. A presence that disrupted their assumptions. But what they didn't yet know was who he really was. And that realization? It was coming. An hour into the flight, the plane hummed steadily against the sky, gliding above a sea of clouds. The first-class cabin had settled into its mid-flight rhythm: soft murmurs, the faint clink of glasses, and the occasional rustle of newspapers or tablet swipes. Elliot Morgan, still in seat 2A, remained immersed in his tablet, his fingers scrolling past charts of breach analytics, attack vectors, and layered encryption models. He was reviewing the final segment of his pitch. The part where he'd explain how Morgan Cyber Systems had already thwarted 2 ransomware attacks targeting state departments in the past year, when a slight jolt of turbulence interrupted the serenity. Nothing major, just a subtle reminder of their altitude. Flight attendant Sophie, the same young woman who had earlier dealt with Douglas Whitmore's seating request, gracefully made her way down the aisle, checking on passengers with practiced warmth. As she reached Elliot's row, she glanced sideways and noticed the glowing graphs on his screen. Curiosity sparkled in her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she said, pausing just beside his seat. Are you in finance or tech? Elliot looked up, calm and approachable. Tech, he replied. Cybersecurity, to be exact. Sophie lit up. That's fascinating. My brother's in IT. He always says cybersecurity is the future. He's not wrong, Elliot smiled gently. It's becoming more essential by the day. Just across the aisle, Douglas Whitmore shifted. He had been silently brooding, arms folded, feet crossed too tightly. But the word cybersecurity seemed to catch his attention like a spark in the dark. He leaned ever so slightly forward, his ears suddenly tuned to a conversation he'd previously dismissed. Elliot noticed but made no acknowledgement. He was used to this pivot, the moment when interest replaced indifference. When credentials finally cut through bias. Sophie lingered for another moment, clearly interested but too professional to pry further. She nodded politely and continued her rounds. Genevieve, who had observed the interaction, now glanced at her husband. Douglas's posture had changed. His brow furrowed, not in distaste this time, but contemplation. He turned toward Elliot, hesitant. Did I hear correctly? Douglas asked, his voice lower, more respectful. You're in cybersecurity. Elliot looked up again, this time with the composed grace of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and what kind of man he was dealing with. That's right, he said. I'm the CEO of Morgan Cyber Systems. We design security architecture for corporations and government clients. A pause. Douglas blinked. The name clicked. Recognition dawned like a flickering bulb. Wait, you were in Forbes last month, weren't you? That feature on emerging tech leaders. You were one of them. Elliot nodded once. That's correct. Suddenly, the air shifted. The entitlement that had previously clung to Douglas's every move like expensive cologne began to evaporate. In its place, uncertainty. Surprise. And, beneath it all, a dawning respect, or perhaps a deeply uncomfortable regret. Well, Mr. Morgan, I must say, that's quite impressive. Cybersecurity is, absolutely vital these days. You must be doing quite well for yourself. Elliot gave a polite nod. We've been fortunate. Hard work tends to find its reward. Douglas tried to laugh, though it came out thin and hollow. He tugged at his cuff. Indeed. My firm, Whitmore Holdings, we've been reviewing our own infrastructure recently. Perhaps. I don't know, maybe there's a conversation to be had. Before Elliot could respond, Genevieve interjected. Her tone was warmer now, her demeanor softened. Actually, we've been meaning to explore modern security solutions. Everything is so vulnerable these days. Data leaks, phishing scams, you name it. Elliot offered them a diplomatic smile. I understand. It's a growing concern across many industries. But he didn't offer a business card. He didn't offer a follow-up meeting. He didn't offer anything more. Because he knew this new interest wasn't born from genuine appreciation of his work or values. It came only after confirmation, after reading the headline, not the man. Sophie soon returned with a silver tray of refreshments. She offered Elliot a drink and paused again before moving on. If you don't mind me saying, Mr. Morgan, she said, her voice sincere, what you've achieved is really inspiring. Elliot met her gaze, and for a moment, the professional mask lifted. He smiled, warm and appreciative. Thank you, Sophie. That means a lot. The sincerity in her words landed deeper than any of the Whitmore's sudden curiosity. Across the aisle, Douglas sat silently. He stared out the window, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. Genevieve glanced between her husband and Elliot, her own expression unreadable. What had begun as silent condescension had evolved into a forced civility, and now teetered towards something closer to quiet reflection. They had misjudged Elliot. Not based on behavior, intelligence, or conversation. but based on assumption. And now that the truth stood before them, impeccably dressed, eloquent, and successful, they weren't quite sure how to process it. But Elliot wasn't there to teach them. He didn't need to correct them. His success, his presence, and his silence spoke for themselves. As the cabin lights dimmed for the final stretch of the flight, Elliot reclined slightly, resuming his review. He had a deal to secure. He had investors to impress. He had a future to build, and he didn't need their approval to build it. The engines whispered beneath them, steady as ever, while overhead lights dimmed to a low amber. Flight 237 coasted smoothly through the upper atmosphere. The outside world was nothing but darkness and clouds, but inside the first-class cabin, the transformation was visible, even if subtle. Elliot Morgan sat motionless, his tablet screen reflecting faint blue light across his face. He wasn't just reading, he was refining, rehearsing, absorbing. The numbers were right. The tech was sound. The strategy flawless. But even with all that, he knew the most important part of any meeting would be how he entered the room. He would enter like he belonged. Because he did. Across the aisle, Douglas Whitmore hadn't said another word since learning Elliot's name and title. That earlier bravado, the kind that allowed him to request a seat change with barely veiled disdain, had drained out of him like air from a pinpricked balloon. His posture had shifted from rigid confidence to something resembling uncertainty. His arms weren't folded anymore. His legs were no longer crossed like a judge preparing a verdict. Instead, he sat still, as if contemplating something that made him uncomfortable. Genevieve, for her part, was glancing more frequently toward Elliot. Not with the dismissiveness of earlier, nor with calculated networking ambition. There was something else in her eyes now, curiosity, maybe even unease. It was the kind of look people give when they realize they've misunderstood a situation, and now it was too late to fix it cleanly. Their daughter hadn't looked up from her phone. Their son had fallen asleep with headphones on. A bell chimed overhead. Sophie, the flight attendant, reappeared to begin the final rounds before landing. She offered gentle smiles, making her way row by row, but paused as she neared Elliot's seat again. Her glance toward his screen was brief this time. Professional, not intrusive. "I hope the flight's been comfortable for you, Mr. Morgan," she said softly. "It has." "Thank you," Elliot replied, his voice low and even. She nodded, gave him a knowing look, and continued down the aisle. As she passed Douglas and Genevieve, her smile was polite but colder than before. Professional boundaries remained intact, but the warmth she offered Elliot was not replicated for them. That was not lost on either of them. The silence thickened for a few more minutes, until finally, Douglas spoke again. But this time, there was no arrogance, no posturing, just a tentative, quiet tone. "Mr. Morgan," Elliot didn't look up immediately. He finished scrolling to the end of a slide before lifting his gaze across the aisle. His face remained unreadable. Douglas cleared his throat. "I just wanted to apologize. If we gave you the impression that you were unwelcome earlier, that wasn't appropriate. It was uncalled for." There it was. The words didn't stumble. They weren't muttered. But they were delivered with a hesitation that revealed their unfamiliarity. Douglas Whitmore was not a man used to apologizing, especially not to people he'd judged in silence. But here, at 30,000 feet, stripped of his boardroom, his country club, and his comfort, he had no shield. Elliot held his gaze. No contempt. No forgiveness either, not immediately. Second stretched. "Apology accepted," Elliot said calmly. But his tone was measured, firm, final. Not dismissive, but not indulgent either. A response rooted in clarity, not emotion. The conversation ended there. And that was enough. Genevieve didn't speak. But she reached across and touched her husband's hand, a gesture less of comfort, more of quiet acknowledgement. Whatever their reason for sitting in silence earlier, it had evolved now into thoughtfulness. Perhaps even guilt. They sat quietly the rest of the flight, like students who had just been shown the cost of an assumption. Meanwhile, Elliot returned to his work, unbothered and untouched. Because this moment, this apology, wasn't the destination. It wasn't even a stop along the way. It was simply turbulence, brief, inevitable, and behind him. The captain's voice cut through the speaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into New York in approximately 15 minutes. Please fasten your seatbelts." Elliot closed his tablet with deliberate calm. His pitch was ready. His moment was near. He leaned back, exhaled, and allowed himself a moment of stillness. Around him, the flight resumed its usual rhythm, flight attendants preparing the cabin, passengers stretching and yawning, window shades tilting open to catch a glimpse of city lights far below. When the plane finally touched down at JFK International, a soft chorus of clicks and seatbelt unbuckling echoed through the cabin. Elliot stood, retrieving his briefcase and jacket. As he turned toward the aisle, Sophie was already at the exit, offering her parting smile. "Safe travels, Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice warm and proud. "Thank you, Sophie." And with that, he stepped out into the terminal, his stride unwavering. He didn't look back. Because he didn't need to. The doors to Flight 237 slid open with a soft hiss as the jet bridge extended into the terminal. A warm gust of air greeted the passengers, a blend of filtered airport air, ambition, and the faint scent of coffee from a nearby kiosk. New York City was just beyond the glass walls, pulsing with energy, waiting to be conquered. Elliot Morgan stepped off the plane with the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. His leather briefcase swung at his side, his suit crisp despite the hours of sitting. The ground beneath his feet felt steady. He had walked into countless rooms before, corporate offices, conference centers, government halls, but something about this arrival felt different. Not because of what had happened on the plane, but because of how little it mattered now. He was on his way to something greater. Behind him, the first-class cabin emptied slowly. The Whitmore family remained in their seats longer than most, gathering their things in silence. Douglas didn't speak. He stared ahead, one hand gripping the armrest with unusual intensity. Genevieve was quieter than usual, her usual poise dimmed by something unspoken. Their children, unaware of the shifts that had occurred midair, simply followed along. Douglas glanced toward the jet bridge where Elliot had disappeared. His lips pressed into a thin, uncertain line. Not of anger, but reflection. For the first time in years, he had felt small. Not because Elliot had said anything cruel. Not because he had been dismissed or corrected. But because the man he had judged had revealed nothing but dignity, excellence, and restraint. Douglas had built his identity on status, on appearances, on the curated world of who belonged where. And for just a moment, that identity cracked. He saw himself clearly, and didn't like what he saw. Genevieve broke the silence. He didn't have to be kind. Douglas nodded slowly. But he was. They walked off the plane, a little slower than before, weighed down not by luggage but by the weight of introspection. Back in the terminal, Elliot walked with purpose through the terminal toward the private car waiting to take him to his hotel in Midtown. As he passed the rows of people and signs, he noticed glances again, but these were different. They weren't tinted by assumption. They were curious. Unaware of who he was. And that was fine. He knew. His phone buzzed with a calendar reminder, investor briefing, 9 a.m. The meeting that could shift the trajectory of Morgan Cyber Systems forever was just hours away. He had the data. He had the story. He had the poise. And now, he had something extra. Clarity. The flight had been a reminder that the world still held prejudices, not all of them loud, not all of them violent. Some came in glances. Some came in requests to move seats. Some came in silence. But they all stemmed from the same root, a story already written about someone you never took the time to know. But Elliot was no stranger to rewriting stories. In his world, codes were broken, vulnerabilities exposed, threats neutralized. And now, he realized, that work wasn't just digital. It was human. Later that evening, in a quiet hotel room 20 floors above Manhattan, Elliot stood by the window and watched the city light up like a motherboard. Flashes of yellow and red and blue in constant motion. He sipped black tea from a white ceramic mug, tablet in hand, running through the final draft of his pitch. On the small desk behind him sat the invitation-only packet from the venture capital firm. The logo was sleek, the embossed letters crisp. But to him, it was just another door, one of many he'd learned to walk through, whether open for him or not. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a blocked number, Mr. Morgan, this is Douglas Whitmore. I understand we didn't part on the best terms. I wanted to thank you for your grace earlier. You taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn. If you're ever open to it, I'd appreciate a second chance to speak properly. Elliot read it. He didn't reply. Not because he was cold. But because some lessons don't require an answer. They just require space to settle. On the other side of town, Douglas sat in a quiet study, his phone beside him, the glow of a reading lamp casting shadows across the shelves filled with books he rarely touched. Genevieve watched him from the doorway. Did you send it? She asked. He nodded. And? He shrugged faintly. I don't know. But maybe that's the point. She walked in, sat beside him, and placed her hand over his. He made you uncomfortable, she said softly. But only because you made assumptions. It's a gift, you know, to be shown something about yourself. Douglas didn't answer. But his silence this time was not avoidance. It was acceptance. The next morning, Elliot stood before a long, polished table in a corner office overlooking Manhattan. Across from him sat 6 investors, each with their portfolios open, pens poised, eyes locked in. He delivered the pitch. Flawlessly. Because for Elliot Morgan, no prejudice, no judgment, no stray glance could ever undo what he had built. And as he walked out of that boardroom, contract in hand, future in motion, he carried with him the one thing the Whitmores hadn't understood at first. That true power doesn't come from wealth or reputation. It comes from knowing exactly who you are. And never needing anyone's permission to be it. In life, we often make assumptions based on appearance, status, or silent biases we may not even realize we carry. But true character, true worth, is rarely loud. It walks quietly, carries itself with dignity, and speaks through action, not noise. In this story, we saw a man wrongly judged for how he looked rather than who he was. But he never wavered. He didn't retaliate, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood in the truth of who he was. And that silent strength changed everything. For adults and seniors, this lesson resonates deeply. We've all seen how society can rush to judgment, how people can misread others in seconds. But the older we get, the more we understand that true wisdom lies in observation, in restraint, and in the power of humility. There is great strength in not needing to prove yourself to anyone. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all, just grace, integrity, and consistency. This story reminds us to look deeper. To never underestimate someone based on first impressions. And above all, to carry ourselves with the quiet confidence that truth and hard work will always shine through. If this message touched you, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? Your support means everything to us. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next story that just might change how you see the world.